Okay, let's get straight down to the questions. And the first comes from Paul in Harrow, who asks this. Does the team know of any pushback on Trump's no mail-in ballots plan from groups representing the infirm or the disabled? So do we know if anyone in Trump's team, Paul asks, has considered how much they could let such groups vote, or do they plan to simply disenfranchise all who cannot get to a polling station? He is a big enemy of mail-in ballots. He's also an enemy of voting machines, isn't he? But on the mail-in ballots, which he says he can get rid of, he has the power to do it. Where do we stand, Sumi?
Well, it's interesting, actually. We saw this come up again this week in Donald Trump's interview with Sean Hannity on Fox after the summit with Vladimir Putin last week. Let's just play a clip of that first.
Vladimir Putin said something, one of the most interesting things. He said, your election was rigged because you have mail-in voting. He said, mail-in voting, every election. He said, no country has mail-in voting. It's impossible to have mail-in voting and have honest elections. And he said that to me. It was very interesting because we talked about 2020. He said, you won that election by so much. And that's how he got it. He said, and if you would have won, we wouldn't have had a war. You'd have all these millions of people alive now instead of dead.
So, yeah, Justin, as you know, this has been a long-running grievance of Donald Trump. To your question, can he do this? The short answer is no. The Constitution actually says that the time, place, and manner of elections are to be regulated by the state legislature, and that Congress can make changes to elections or how they're administered, but only if those changes actually are based on congressional or presidential elections. So states, for example, when they hold elections on governors, there is no kind of congressional oversight or changes that can be made by Congress there. And nowhere in the Constitution does it actually mention the president's name in terms of being able to change mail-in ballots. But, Justin, this is something President Trump has been talking about since 2020, when he has claimed many times without evidence that there was massive fraud leading to his loss in the election, partly because of mail-in ballots.
Yeah, so I think the answer for Paul is we don't really think it's going to happen. It's one of those things, if we divide up all the things that Donald Trump says into those that actually are going to happen, and he's certainly done some things and shaken some things up, and those he just says, a bit like reopening Alcatraz, where you think, okay, I mean, maybe it's an aspiration, and maybe it ticks a few boxes that you want to tick and G's up your supporters in this way or that way. But actually the mechanics of doing it don't seem clear. So I think actually in a way, Paul, that possibly answers your question about the extent to which groups have pushed back. I think a lot of groups probably, Sumi, it's right to say, don't think you need to much because it's not a kind of urgent thing that is likely to happen. I'm only aware of one actually that has, and that is people representing people who are fighting abroad or stationed abroad for the US. And there is a big, they were quite vocal, weren't they? Because one of the things that the abolition of mail-in ballots would presumably entail would be getting rid of the ability of soldiers, airmen, airwomen, etc., to be able to vote. And that is that's sort of viewed, isn't it, in America as a really important sacred right for people sent abroad to stick up for the country.
It really is. I can say I lived out of the country for 15 years and I cast my ballot via absentee ballot in the state of New York for that entire time that I was living abroad. And there are more than 3 million Americans, not counting, of course, the military, who can vote or are eligible to vote from abroad. So that is just one group of people. But on the other hand, you also have, those who are elderly. My parents vote by mail-in ballot now because they find it much more comfortable to do so. And I thought it was really interesting to see Florida's governor, Republican, Ron DeSantis, say he doesn't think that this executive order would apply to Florida. Florida is a state where you do see a lot of mail-in ballots, but of course there is a big elderly population there. And Florida is not one of those states where they immediately send you a mail-in ballot. It's one of those states where you can request one. And he said, well, since we don't immediately send a mail-in ballot to everyone, I don't think this executive order applies to us. Yeah. There are 8 states plus Washington, D.C., where that is the case. But President Trump has been pretty light on the details until now of what he means. But it's really important to a lot of Americans who find it difficult to get to the ballot box on an election day to be able to cast their ballot by mail.
Okay, Daniel in Sheffield, can you please explain how packing and cracking actually works? so that we can understand the context of the Texas row over redistricting. Been some developments about this as well, haven't there, Sumi? Because they're all going back and it's all going through, it seems.
Yeah, exactly. The Democrats who left Texas for 2 weeks are now back in the state. But to the question of packing and cracking, which, is pretty much exactly what it sounds like. So packing is when you pack together constituents or groups of voters who tend to vote in a specific way. So it makes it likely that you'll have this group of voters cast their ballots for their candidate, but that means their influence in another part is lessened. And then cracking is literally breaking apart those groups of voters so that their influence is spread out. And the way I think about this in redistricting, if it helps our listeners and viewers a bit, is I always think of these blue cities in the middle of red states. Let's say, for example, a city like Dallas in Texas. So Texas is a Republican state, a red state, but you have these blue kind of dots within the state like Dallas. So because voters in a city like Dallas will tend to vote more Democrat, you'll get Democrat members of Congress there. Well, what you can do with redistricting in some cases is you can split those voters, or that city, in a way that the voters, their power together to elect a Democrat member of Congress is no longer so potent, so that they're kind of moved together with voters from outside of the city, maybe in the suburbs, who tend to vote more Republican. And that takes away some of that power to vote for a Democrat or a progressive candidate within a city. So that gives you, I hope, our viewers and listeners a bit of an idea of how that can work from the Republican side. And the Democrats have done this, as you know, Justin, as well, in a state like Illinois, where they try to reduce the impact of, or the power of Republican districts by splitting them up so that Democrat voters have a bit more power in those same areas.
Yeah, and it was quite ironic that Illinois was one of the places they escaped to, wasn't it?
That's right.
The Texas people who didn't want to see it done in Texas, but were happy to go to Illinois, where it is done a lot. My favorite one is North Carolina. It's a congressional district that doesn't exist anymore, but at the time it existed, it was an example of packing, actually. And packing, it sounds neat, but often results in these districts that don't look at all neat, because they're packing of a particular kind of person, often a racial group. And this one was by the I-85 in North Carolina. And it was the famous thing that someone said of it was that if you opened both your car doors and drove down the I-85, you would kill everyone in the district, because actually they'd packed it in such a way that it was just people living right next to the road, essentially. Wow. And it was a particular kind. It was actually a Democratic constituency, because the people close to the road, poorer people. I think there was a racial side to it as well. And eventually it went. This was back in the 1990s that I was sent to look at it. But there are all sorts of these things still going on. But, I mean, we should mention as well a kind of hot news, shouldn't we? Because Gavin Newsom in California, the governor there, who's been so feisty about all of this stuff, is going to go ahead, it seems, with what he threatened to do, which is negate any of the Texas gains. So let's assume they do gain 5 seats or so in Texas for the Republicans, and that potentially means that they might be able to hold the midterm elections in 2026, which is what this is all about. This is what he said about it all at a news conference last week.
It's not complicated. We're doing this in reaction to a president of the United States that called a sitting governor of the state of Texas and said, find me 5 seats. We're doing it in reaction to that act. We can't stand back and watch this democracy disappear district by district all across this country. We need to stand up, not just California. Other blue states need to stand up.
Yeah, so that gives you a sense of where Governor Gavin Newsom sees things right now. He sees this as a bit of a challenge that California has to take up, but that has angered another prominent Californian, the former California Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger. He posted a picture of himself on X, and it says, "I'm getting ready for the gerrymandering battle," and he's kind of pumping iron. He has a T-shirt on that says, a word I can't say, the politician.
What does it say, Sumi? I'm just looking at the same picture.
An unsavory
I'm glad you
word.
Stopped.
The politician is, and then it says, terminate gerrymandering. So that was his response. And then, of course, the former Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, she said at a press conference in California this month that the Democrats here, they don't have a choice because they're acting in self-defense.
We will not he's gone too far. We will not let him pave over free and fair elections in our country, starting with what he's trying to do in Texas, countering that. So this isn't two wrongs, or as was mentioned. It's not a wrong in what we're doing. This is self-defense for our democracy.
It should be said, shouldn't it, Sumi, that what Newsom is proposing is not a permanent return to gerrymandering, in the sense that there's an independent commission, isn't there? And what he says is get rid of the commission at least until when? Until 2030. Is that the plan?
Yeah, that's the plan. And he's hoping he can convince voters in California, which of course is a blue state, a Democrat state, that this is important for precisely the reason that Nancy Pelosi just said, self-defense for democracy, as she put it. So Gavin Newsom's ploy here is to say to voters, give us this chance to fight back against Republican moves and make sure that we're on equal footing, so to say, for the midterm elections. And then we can talk again down the road, because, gerrymandering and redistricting has been seen as really problematic by many states. And that's why you have seen states put in these laws or rules to make so that you can't just slice and dice or pack and crack districts by partisan lines. And the fact that they see now Texas doing this means that they want to kind of dial back some of those rules, at least for the time being, and then revisit it down the road.
And all of it, of course, as I was saying, is really about the next election, about the midterm elections, and this fight that if the Democrats lose, and I suppose this is the thinking with Newsom being so tough about it, given that he is almost certainly running for the presidential nomination in 2028. Why did I even say almost? I mean, he is running for the nomination.
Yeah, look at his Twitter account. So he's definitely running.
Look, exactly. Yeah. Listen to his podcast too. Only after Americast, but it is worth listening to, actually. He's positioning himself and doing so really aggressively. And I think he thinks, doesn't he, Sumi, if he can rescue the party from losing the midterms. In other words, the Democrats, who are on course probably to win the midterms next year, that would be what you'd usually expect. If they then go ahead and manage to do it, and they do it partly because of what he's done in California, that really does bolster him, doesn't it?
And there's another element to this. I've talked to Democrat voters who are so frustrated with the brand of the Democrats, and you can just look at polling across the board that Democrat voters are not happy with their own party. And one of the big complaints has been that they don't fight enough, that they're not fighting back. Yeah. And what Gavin Newsom is doing right here is saying, I'm taking the fight directly to the Republicans. And, we talked about his X account, Twitter account, and the fact that we've now seen not necessarily Gavin Newsom himself, but his press team mimicking Donald Trump's tweets, his posts on Truth Social, and the all caps and the type of language he uses. There are some Democrats who will be pleased with the type of strategy that Gavin Newsom is deploying here, saying we need a fighter, and finally someone is taking it directly to Donald Trump and his party. Yeah,
early days, very early days, but he's certainly making a big splash at the moment, isn't he? Let us go on to one of the smoothest voices that we ever have in our inbox.
Hello, Americast. It's Bob in Minneapolis. President Trump says he is confident in his ability to end the war in Ukraine. According to Trump, this is because he has already settled 6 wars in the past 6 months. What were these wars, and what actions did Trump actually take to settle the conflicts?
Should we listen to his claim, Sumi? It came in an interview on Fox and Friends, and he actually increased the figure, I think I'm right in saying, to 7. Let's listen.
I've solved 7 wars. We ended 7 wars. I thought this would be one of the easier ones, and this has turned out to be the toughest one. India, Pakistan, these were big ones, and also all big ones, and some going for 31, 32 years, one for 35 years. The Congo, think of that, the Congo and Rwanda for 35 years. I got that one done.
Your thoughts, Sumi?
Yeah, let's go conflict by conflict. I think that's probably the most helpful way of doing this. And I have the list here in front of me because a lot of people have been putting those questions to the White House's press team to say, which conflicts is he talking about here? How did this number grow to 7? So if you start with Armenia and Azerbaijan, this was just a few weeks ago that you saw the leaders of both countries in the White House. And what President Trump was able to do, and this is really significant, we have to say, this is a long-running conflict that dates back to the 1980s. And one where Russia was traditionally seen as a mediator between these two countries. But Russia, as we know, is continuing to wage its war on Ukraine, and so has less bandwidth, if you will. And President Trump was able to bring these two leaders to the table, and they signed a joint declaration to end their war, their conflict. So, that is really significant. On the other hand, observers of this region say that hasn't solved the underlying crisis there, or the underlying conflict and issues between these two leaders and their two countries. But what it has done, of course, is stop kind of the hot phase of their conflict. And I think that is indeed significant. I mean, we have to say that that's an important development in this region. There
we are. We're giving that one to Trump.
That's right. That's one in his column there that we have to say is one that President Trump was instrumental in.
Okay, big tick for that. What about the Democratic Republic of Congo and Rwanda?
Yeah, so we also saw leaders of both those countries at the White House. This is one that President Trump, you heard him in that clip there say, there's a conflict running 35 years. That is true. Really significant that he got both representatives from both countries to come to the Oval Office, and they signed a peace agreement aimed at ending the conflict. Again, here, though, the details are important, and that is that, they haven't actually resolved the dispute between these two countries. And we have seen just in reports that violence is still continuing. So even though Donald Trump has kind of ticked off this conflict, it's one where a lot more work would have to be done to really ensure that arms are laid down.
What about India and Pakistan? I mean, that's a bit more clear-cut, isn't it? They were having quite a serious conflict. It wasn't quite a war, was it? But it was a pretty serious conflict.
Yeah, nuclear armed neighbors. And Caroline Levitt, the press secretary, said, we were close to a real all-out war between these two nuclear armed neighbors. That is true on the one hand. On the other hand, India says that, yes, the U.S. did play some role in getting these partners to talk to each other, but India says that it directly negotiated a peace agreement with Pakistan there. So it kind of is downplaying the president's role.
Although the Pakistani side, I mean, I remember this from interviews and on other programs that I do, and both of us do other things to me as well. But I remember talking to a Pakistani official who said this is down to Trump. And I think I'm right in saying that they are among those nations proposing Trump for the Nobel Peace Prize. So, there may be all sorts of reasons why they're doing it, but certainly from one side in this conflict, they think he was useful.
Yeah, that is true. The Pakistanis have said that, and they have developed a pretty solid relationship with the Trump administration. We have to say that tariffs there and the threat of tariffs do play a role and have played a role, and I think directly did with Pakistan here.
Anyway, we're only halfway through. Israel and Iran.
Well, we saw the U.S. carry out the bombings of the nuclear sites in Iran and then announce a ceasefire between Israel and Iran, and that has seemed to mostly hold. When it comes to Iran's long-term nuclear ambitions, however, there hasn't really been any progress there. So, the two sides here are not exchanging fire at the moment. So we can say that the U.S. played a role in bringing that to an end, and that was a serious concern, wasn't it, that we were covering, Justin? But at the moment, it remains to be seen whether Iran will actually continue to enrich uranium and rebuild its nuclear sites, because there hasn't been progress on engaging Iran on a diplomatic front. And that is something that, hasn't really been a priority for the White House at the moment, as they've been dealing with other conflicts and hot wars.
Cambodia and Thailand, I just feel that they took an interest in a part of the world and in a conflict that you would not have expected them to take an interest in necessarily when they came to power, and actually did do some good.
That is true. I mean, there was this flare-up in fighting, and there were more than 40 people killed in this flare-up in fighting. And so there were real concerns. And the White House was being asked about this in some of the press briefings. I think there was some attention paid to it. But again, the underlying issues are still there. The disputes are still there. And that is something that hasn't yet been solved. But you have to say, to President Trump's credit, that fighting, which was really a source of concern for everyone in the region in particular, did stop.
Yeah. Egypt and Ethiopia, this is over a dam, isn't it? And it wasn't really a war either.
That's right. And this is one where it really isn't clear that President Trump has been able to make much progress at all. The dispute is still there. And I believe that Ethiopia announced recently that it actually finished the dam, and there hasn't been any progress on their dispute over the dam. And this is about power, and this is Africa's biggest hydroelectric dam. So there's a dispute between these two countries over the control of this dam. But President Trump's diplomacy here hasn't actually resolved the issue of control. I mean, it's kept both sides, if you will, from a hot war, from this descending into an armed conflict of any sort. But still, I'm not so sure that this is one that President Trump can put in his column.
Okay, well, it's a mixed bag. I think we're saying the Trump administration, are we assuming that has been more involved than you might have thought in some disputes around the world? But
I think that's a fair assessment.
Not exactly solved them. Let us go on to this, which is a really interesting question from Betty in Birmingham. Trump has been seen by many MAGA voters as the saviour who'll fulfil their dreams, but we're now seeing a growing dissatisfaction around rising prices, involvement in foreign wars, and Medicare. It's actually Medicaid, I think, more than Medicare. But anyway, what happens, Betty asks, if that disillusionment grows? Will there be a large group of Americans who move even further towards the anti-government survivalist position? Really interesting, actually, because I sort of should we sort of take it in two steps? Number one, are we saying definitely that Trump's popularity is going down?
Well, if you look at the polls, that is the case. Even on the issues where President Trump has performed pretty well so far in the second term, immigration, for example, his numbers have been sliding on that front as well, as you've seen some dissatisfaction with the mass deportation program and some of the ICE tactics and raids that we've seen. So it is fair to say that we are seeing growing dissatisfaction with President Trump, particularly on some of the core issues that he said he would deliver on, like the economy. The prices still have not dropped, and President Trump has sold it as a real win for his administration, that he says inflation is almost zero. That's not true. It is not almost zero. It's still hovering around 2.7%. ish, and even though numbers have come down on some like gas and energy and egg prices, for example, which President Trump is keen to point to, prices are still fairly high and have not come down as quickly as many voters might have hoped. So you do see some dissatisfaction there. Yeah,
and also dissatisfaction. This goes really to the guts of this question, doesn't it? Dissatisfaction with the way in which the Trump administration, actually harking back to the last question, has engaged with the outside world in a way that a lot of MAGA supporters genuinely hoped that it wouldn't, believed that it wouldn't, were told that it wouldn't. And the crucial thing here, of course, is Ukraine, and this sense that you get over and over again from MAGA supporters that Donald Trump is being pushed towards a position that is much more conventional, mainstream, and in their view, disastrous, where he is involved in a way that he doesn't need to be. So let's listen to, I suppose he's the most prominent, isn't he, of the MAGA voices, Steve Bannon, talking about his reservations about US involvement in Ukraine on his War Room podcast recently.
I'm just lost how the United States offering an Article 5 commitment for a security guarantee to Ukraine is a win for the United States. I mean, this war started because of the globalists at the EU, the European Union, and NATO forcing the hand of the Russians over years and years and years about Ukraine's joining the EU and joining NATO.
Yeah, Justin, I think it's important just first of all to kind of push back on that claim from Steve Bannon, because it completely rejects any agency on the behalf of the Ukrainians who were aspiring towards EU and NATO membership. And it is a Kremlin talking point to say that the West was forcing the hand of the Russians by encroaching on their territories, essentially what Steve Bannon is saying. But it is really interesting to hear some of the concern from the core MAGA base, if you will, over security guarantees for Ukraine. And what President Trump has floated so far is not U.S. troops on the ground in Ukraine, but perhaps U.S. pilots, air cover for Ukraine, And that's after meeting with European leaders in that summit in the White House. But he was someone who President Trump promised to, as you know, end the war in Ukraine on day one. He has said, look, this war is much more difficult than I had anticipated. But pushing for a way that the U.S. would support Ukraine actually by engaging militarily is one that's going to be more difficult to sell to some of his base.
Yeah. There was, of course, another part, wasn't there, to that question, which is where Americans go if they do fall out of love with Donald Trump. Where do the MAGA people go? Where do other Americans go who don't like him anymore? People who are just annoyed about inflation. I mean, the answer, Sumi, I suppose, is you just don't vote. You just don't take any interest anymore.
That would be my answer to the question, voter apathy. Something that really struck me again, traveling through the country ahead of the 2024 election in November, is how many voters were so turned off by the political system and by both parties that they simply said, I'm not going to vote. I don't see any impact on my life at all. I wonder if it means independent candidates in, more regional races or local races will have more success. But as you know, independent candidates don't really work on a national level.
Yeah, it's tough, isn't it? It's really tough. I mean, there have been people who have broken through. Ross Perot, I suppose, running for the presidency back in 1992. Not that he got anywhere in the end, but he got a fair chunk of the vote. So there are places that people can go that aren't necessarily nowhere and aren't necessarily anti-government survivalists, as our questioner says. But to do that nationally isn't going to cut the mustard, I don't think. Anyhow, interesting question. Let us turn for our last one and to Pete in Bath, where Anthony was recently and where I am often. Here's Pete.
Are Trump's plans for a UFC fight at the White House next 4th of July a sign he is going full Caligula and bringing gains to the people? Thanks very much.
I think we have a clip of UFC boss and friend of Donald Trump, Dana White, confirming the fight last week. And remember, he is a very close friend and ally of Donald Trump.
It is definitely going to happen. I talked to him last night, him being the president, and I'm flying out there at the end of this month, and I'm going to sit down and walk him through, all the plans and the renderings, and we're going to start deciding what he wants and doesn't want. But yeah, July 4th, 250th birthday of the United States of America, live on CBS from the White House. I'm pretty excited.
Yes, and so will a lot of Americans be, but a lot of other Americans, particularly in the nation's finer universities, etc., will be thinking, oh my goodness, we did not see this coming. This is not a proper way to be celebrating the birthday of the nation, let alone the 250th birthday. It's another thing that will divide America, and that's what he wants, really, isn't it?
It is. I don't know how many Americans I haven't looked at the numbers on how many Americans follow the UFC and how many Americans are regular watchers of fights, either in person, on TV. I have to admit, Justin, I've been trying to actively ignore this story simply because, there's so much else going on. And of course, looking ahead to the 250th birthday of the U.S., so much can and will change until then. But it is curious, Donald Trump has been undertaking all sorts of changes at the White House, as you know. If you look inside the images of the Oval Office these days and you see the gilded doors and everything that he has changed to his taste, which obviously he can do as the president, and he is allowed to make those changes. You really wonder about hosting a UFC fight at the White House and whether that will be considered an appropriate way to celebrate the U.S.'s 250th birthday.
Yeah, and the answer to whether it's for the masses, a sort of, to the implication of our questioner to take people's minds off other things. I actually don't think it takes people's minds off other things, and I don't think that is the Donald Trump way. I think the constancy of the distractions and the moves into different areas and the enthusiasms that then sort of fizzle away, that's just part of the man, and it's part of this presidency. And I think by the time this comes, this fight, if it does come, people will be used to it, but also people will be thinking ahead. They'll be thinking to certainly the midterms, but also be thinking to the next presidential election. I'm not sure in the end it will really matter that much. He's not standing again, is he? I don't think it'll be sort of a huge deal where people say, as they have done so often in the past, he can't get away with this, he can't do this, because he does always get away with it and he does always do it.
Yeah, and remember that Donald Trump sees his, showing up at big sporting events, at NFL games and UFC fights, that he sees as part of his way to connect in particular with young men, and that was really effective ahead of the 2024 election. So maybe this is another way to do that ahead of the midterms. But to your point, he's not on the ballot next November. So, what big difference will this actually make? Not sure, but maybe, as you said, it's just a way for Donald Trump to enjoy something in his second term, something he really wants to do and enjoys doing. And Dana White is someone he sees as a close friend. So this is bringing all of those threads together.
And the young men point, not to be too kind of ploddingly serious about this, but the young men point is important, isn't it? Because that is a place where he did very well. It's a place where the Democrats are really struggling because they don't know what the message is going to be. And they had that much derided commission, didn't they? They spent a ton of money kind of investigating what young men were like, as if they were sort of alien species. And so anything Trump can do along these lines to say, yeah, this is what young men like, and if you don't like it, what the heck? And the Democrats sort of will once again be in this sort of slightly cringy position where they can't exactly say we're against UFC, but they can be against it in the White House. But does that mean they're against the whole thing? And what do they think of young men? What do they think of, the organised violence that is often involved in young men's sports, not just in this one? It just puts them into a kind of position, particularly a party that has, embraced its feminine side in recent years, to the extent to which it has maybe put some men off being supporters. It's another of those tricky ones for them.
My bet is that Democrats will try to steer clear of that argument and maybe make the point that the president is spending millions organizing a UFC fight at the White House while people are still struggling to pay for their groceries.
Yeah.
That's probably the line of attack that the Democrats
You
will
can
take.
see that's going to be what James Carville and all the other kind of operatives, consultants, etc. That class of people who advise the Democrats and who want the Democrats to reconnect with people. They're going to say to them, for goodness sake, don't be put in that box, literally and metaphorically, when it comes to the UFC. Make sure that you've got lines of attack on it that make sense to people at the time and don't attack the sport itself. Okay, Sumi, that's pretty much it, I think. A huge thanks to all our questioners. We had some really interesting ones then, and I will see you, if not before, I'll see you at the fight.
Looking forward to it, and thanks for having me.
Bye.
Bye.